Good afternoon. So because I've already been introduced, I'm going to go into the matter. I had been surprised that there was a conference without a talk about Active Directory. Um, I am I am like this older guys always talking about things of the past, and I've always keep saying that Active Directory is very important, and nobody listens to me. But Microsoft has produced something that's called AAD, Azure Active Directory, which is not a controller of domain in the cloud. It's completely different, but because they have named it AD, it's been given to AD. So if so that's a dangerous situation because the people in security have to know about this, and so you have to look at Active Directory a lot more than you are. It's a key part of all the ransomware attacks. They're being attacked at Active Directory, so focus on that. So the title is AD is dead, long live AAD. So about AD is dead, well, you have to put this into a context. Is it dead? What's new in Active Directory in 2019? Does anybody know? Well, this is the answer. There's nothing. Well, yes, they've added a new attribute. How many people are improving Active Directory? Nobody. There's nobody. Do they solve problems? Well, that's gonna be in 2022. But you have to understand that the development is in Azure Active Directory, and there's nobody in ADDS. There's also the certificate services. We have novelty there, but in the traditional Active Directory, there's no development. So what has happened in the last 20 years? Why have the company decided not to continue developing Active Directory? Well, it's because of the cloud. Because there's Kerberos that we cannot really touch, and the app through internet, it doesn't work very well because it's in clear, and FRVD, it is updated, but in general these are technologies that have not been developed for this. And the second thing that has happened are mobile devices, because when this started, mobiles didn't exist, and in the future this trend is going to continue. And the third thing that has happened are users. Because nowadays what happens is that people don't work so much with people in their company, but with people outside of their company, and that's why Active Directory is not so crucial. And finally, AI, which is so trendy, and that works better in the cloud because you have huge load peaks, and that's why we go back to the beginning. So Active Directory, it's a cloud technology, which according to marketing looks like this: open IDs. And Kerberos, no Kerbero. There is an exception, but the answer tends to be no, HTTP. It has a network API, and it also has a protocol called SPIN, which is good for account provisions. And then this is for Office 365. Everybody using 365 uses Azure AD, because all of that is, so there are people who are not aware that this part is in their organization, but it is there. And there's also an integration like a cloud of Active Directory, which is good for the authentication of applications, and there are cloud applications, but it's really good for almost everything else. But this is in theory, this is more reality. I love this slide, although it's shocking for some people. This is where we are, and I'm going to say this. People in the left have And you see the Active Directory at the top to the left. There are a number of parts that we shall see which are about integration in Active Directory, and there can be attack. And then if you go to the top right, you see Microsoft Cloud Services and Devices. So, but not only Microsoft services. Do you want to integrate this with Salesforce, and there are actually native applications that generate users, and finally at the bottom there's the integration with Azure, and Azure AD doesn't exist. It's not a virtual machine that exists. I will explain this later. The implications for security. And around this, there are a number of services where I have a backend where we keep the users, objects, machines. When you end up generating a directory, but it's not an active directory. And then in terms of services, the resetting of passwords and things of the sort. So it's more about identity management than the older repositories and authentication of the past. So let's start talking about the hybrid world part. And the first thing is about the types of session initiation. The users directly on the cloud with an API. So I'm going to create active directories in the cloud and with these protocols, and that's it. But this is not reality. The reality of most companies is that they want to have their users in active directory. So you want to press a button and to have them all in the cloud to give them some feature. But here we're talking about synchronized users, and this is the first part of a server that you have to set up in your organization, the connect architecture, which is like a meta directory, the castrated Microsoft meta directory, just to transfer users, simplifying. So this is the first part in these three synchronized steps. And then depending on how you want to do the authentication, if you want to authenticate directly in the cloud, it's gone differently, and if not, there are two alternatives. So the first way, talking not so much about cloud users, but about attack surface. The first way is what we call the password hash sync, which is I take a user that I have in the directory, but I take the name and the UPN and the department, and I put that in an object in Azure AD directory, and I also synchronize the password. What for? So that when I go to portal.office and it asks for users and password, and for that authentication, I do need an Active Directory. The password is not uploaded just so, but it is hashed enough in a more direct, modern way. But basically, it's a hash from a hash that goes to Azure Active Directory, AAD. And for this to work at the server, that has an account in Active Directory needs to be given a number of permissions, which are these ones. Do they ring a bell with anybody? Yes, these are the sync, yes. Well, because it does exactly the same thing as Mimicat does. So I was here in 2017 talking about a tool that's called ATA, Orato, some Israeli guys that were bought by Microsoft, and this has this option. But what happens? Well, these three items at the top, which is this is Azure AD that has to synchronize the passwords. I'm going to exclude that. Well, if you compromise the AAD, and nobody's going to detect that, and it will look like it's a normal behavior. Second part, or second way in which you can do authentication. I don't want to give Microsoft the passwords. I want users to exist at the top, but each one they have to authenticate. That authenticate has to be done against the Active Directory. And for that, we have two ways. The first one is to do pass-through authentication. The server is at the bottom, and you can set up one or several of them. And when the user goes to the directory. There's a form, and sometimes there is a sign-on, a user, password, and we give it to AAD. So it is not stored, it's encrypted, sent to the authentication agent, which deciphers it. So there's been like a federation between the pass-through authentication and the AAD, and the pass-through authentication deciphers, and that's validated against the Active Directory. Okay, so what's the problem here? If you compromise the pass-through authentication, and this is a technique, and I think Cat last year did it with hijacking the LL. You can access the password of users. You don't have access to all passwords. You cannot do a walnut ticket because of the way it is validated. But as users validate, you have their password, so it's difficult to protect as well. Third option, the other way, is to do federation. Microsoft, I don't want Microsoft to have my passwords, and I don't want when somebody validates the password to go through that. And in that case, you do this federation using ADFS or in some other way, but it's about a federation. I give you my metadata. I tell you with which certificates I'm going to sign the tokens, and when a user goes to writes @contoso.com, this is a federated domain, and I direct the user to the FS farm, which is going to validate it. So this is done in a way that Azure AD trusts, and this is done with an inverse proxy, this part here. And this is to see if this happens on internet, to publish in ADFS. But if you compromise the FS, then you can set up your own ADFS and sign certificates, and you can validate any user that has an account in AD for my organization. So this is just a form where you write user and password. So as users validate themselves, you can have a false form. And there is a fourth part which is not connected with authentication, but which is in data centers, and its use is that people use modern authentication to access services with an inverse broken, which people in security do not like so much because the name is close to what you want to post within the internal network, and that opens a connection against the AAD. And the good thing about this is that the user is validated against AAD, and once it is validated, you do everything you want, you download the authentication, whatever, and when everything's there, when you have everything, that's when you open a channel for the user to be able to access the application. So non-authenticated users have no attack surface. That's the good part. Authenticated users, the connection is from inside to outwards, and you let it access through a channel. So what's the problem here? There's a twofold problem. If they become administrators of the AAD, and we will talk about this, we're talking about equivalent roles to the domain administrator. And if this part is set up and I become administrator, I can create my own publications with this interface, and I say, rather than publishing this application, you can publish this other application. So basically, I have a channel to access from internet to anything that's in my internal network, getting through that part. And it's a channel that has been established theoretically from inside outwards. The second part is that in authentication against AAD, I've done with OpenID, but this application usually will work with Kerberos. So I don't want to have to input twice user and password for this double authentication. So that server I tell it that it can ask for a Cerberus ticket in the name of one user, of every user, to access that back end. So if you compromise that server, then you can impersonate every user. And you should have that third option, but people sometimes press the second one, this is good for any backend. So if you compromise this server, you have total control of the environment. So it's control of the domain controller. So this is the end of the first part, which is which part are compromised that can give access to Active Directory or to Azure AD, depending on the condition. So this allows the impersonation of any user in Azure AD, because the account A that used to synchronize to account A in the cloud now sort of synchronizes with another account. So you can have a user sort of switching to a different, and then we also have access of the passwords so you have control. The pass-through authentication agent also gives you access, ADFS. You have access to the cloud and impersonation of any user and to the passwords as they authenticate themselves. And I won't repeat in WAP, but then, and I write others like the KPI or the DNS. If I can send things rather than to WAP to another service, then we have other possibilities. So the summary of all this is that if any of these parts is compromised, it's like you've compromised a domain controller. And I don't want people to think that AAD is insecure, but it's just like as insecure as having a domain control. So this is the idea of tiers. We used to defend the network and segment it. If now we defend identities, we have to segment those identities. So these models, we're going to have three types of identities and their dependencies. From the bottom up, first of all, from where I access information, user accounts, that's tier 2. Where I keep the data, tier 1. The identity repositories, that's tier 0. So what's an Azure AD? That's tier 0. So a tier 0 account cannot be used in a tier 1 system, because that can be stolen, because if the tier 1 system is compromised, it can be stolen. So I want you to understand that this very model here, I'm talking about servers, but it's the same thing with clouds. So we can have a model, for instance, and I've done this, roles in Azure and Azure AD. But before that, this distinction that I was talking about, that AAD does not exist within an Azure subscription, and this is special and not so obvious. And when you look at the demo, you will see that the Azure AD, it's like you look at the virtual machines and you only see AAD. So it allows you to believe that it exists within the subscription, but that's not the case. And it also means that there are roles, Azure roles, who has a right to create virtual machines, and then there are roles in Azure AD that has the possibility of creating users, and these are independent accounts. And usually the Azure administrators exist inside of an Azure AD, and so if that is compromised, everything else is compromised. Okay? But the other way around, the dependency doesn't exist, although we will see now. But in general, an Azure AD cannot reset the passwords of people. Okay? So these roles, this is an API behind. These are just the permissions in the API. Can I publish application, yes or no? Can I change the password? So there are roles, and you can say, I am going to give you only this and these permissions, and these tiers roles can be extracted and say which roles are the Azure AD tier 0. and there is a list of directory roles. And I'm not going to tell you all of them, but I'd like to step the one at top, the global administrator, which is what they somewhere else it's called Convoy administration, which means total control. If that's compromised, that's the end. And I also like the last one that not so many people know, which is the administrator of the portal enterprise. And this is a different portal, which is not Azure, where the finance person generates here Azure subscriptions, and the person there is the person in finances. So this is another. Are you familiar with this portal? Check who is there, because they can add subscriptions to Azure. And you might think it doesn't look so serious, because we've said that Azure subscription is not enough to become administrator. But look at the right-hand side. If I've started saying, if you compromise Azure AD Connect, that's the end. But how about if you've created it as a virtual machine in an Azure subscription, which is quite common? You can say, I don't want to set up machines, I do it on the cloud directly. These are virtual machines. So it's upside down then, because if that's the case, the administrator of that subscription can take control of those machines. And if it takes control of these machines, it can become administrator of Azure AD. And there's something else, the Inter administrator, which is an MDM, which is good to control client machines, which is not identity control. But you will see why that matters, why is that important. And the same thing applies to Tier 1, the Exchange administrator. So we're talking here about data, and the same thing for Tier 2, which is where you access those data from. So what gives you control of the client machines. So which are the good practices for these accounts? The least, the better. The more probabilities of compromise. If there are 200 domain administrators, that is a problem. And if you see here 200 global admin, that's a problem. And the second one is strong authentication. This Azure AD has a license, and there's a free one and there's a payment one. To have, well, this strong authentication is you have to pay for. This runs on Fido, on Wiki, so, but unfortunately 90% of the Azure AD do not have a strong authentication. And that's so much the case that right now they've changed, and you bring a pen and toy, they force you to have it. And those who are there, they're changing it. We're going to change it by default, but the new ones come with that. And monitoring, there is a global admin, that's something strange. And use a just-in-time system, and use administration machines. I will tell you more about this.
It's PAM Incorporated. It has its own PAM, it uses just-in-time. They put in the groups and they get you out. The interface it has, it's like this, and you can make approvals, a service ticket, everything. The second thing that I was saying is using administration machines. That's the other things. I feel like an old man crying to the cloud. How can I explain this? If I compromise the machine from which it is administered, it's pointless to manage what is being administered. These jump services don't solve this, they just make it slower in the process. PAMs, which start sessions, don't solve this problem, they just make it slower. Why? Because the attacker opens the session or wait until you open it, and once you have the session open, they hijack your session. If the session is an RDP, it's RDP hijacking. If it's in most of PAM, it's like they steal your cookie, and they're authenticated as they were you. And as this cookie said you had multi-factor, it's great, they are you, and they're global admin. The summary of this is that you have to make the client, the keyword is safe. It's not possible that the keyword, if while I'm navigating and writing emails, and after a minute, entering, and a minute after I'm entering as a global administrator. Microsoft has taken this to the extreme, and there are 30,000 people who have two physical PCs. Do you have two PCs? No, because I don't have Azure Production 365, and I don't develop Windows code, which end in all your machines. But everyone in those conditions has its own PC. The first solution for you is maybe 2 virtual machines. That's an compromise between safety and convenience that has to be taken. The second half of it is that, okay, one thing is that you are attacked because you are reading an email and you're receiving phishing, and how many people is able to administer your machine since where you administer? The security guy can become administrator, yes, and the CEO and the CAO, yes. How many people can become administrator in a machine from which Azure AD is administrated? 200 people. And we go back to the original problem. So the suggestion is here that administering machines then be administered by CEO, and it has to be done only by a few people. And the way to do this is through the cloud. They are not related to SCCM. The machines are connected to Intune, and you put a tool, an antivirus iTool or Defender, but it has to be managed from the cloud. And if you took all the permissions on those clouds, you just read 2 accounts. That's the point. That's the cloud POW idea, which is why I suggest you to implement, because in Synapse we see that lateral movement comes from administrators, one and over and over. That's the way to stop that. Where is Microsoft IT today? We are the ones that use it first. If we see who is general administrator, because they use just in time, everything is done through administration machines, and they give 2 accounts for people, one for email and one account to become administrator of Azure AD, as we have been doing all live. Another subject. Do you use Azure AD? Oh, yes. They say yes. I use it from AD as it is synchronized. Some people say that we use AAD for internal users. Normally that's fake in 3 cases. We will see how, but I'm going to take a step back. Do you remember what I said about of an Active Directory with external users? Externals came to my company. What did we do with them? We created an account. Some advanced people had a domain which was like external. It's part of the same forest, so it's quite useless. Some people create their own EU to have some control, but an Active Directory user may have many permissions, and the external could have those access to. In Azure AD, it's the same. A user can list, and why he can list? Because if I want to invite you to a SharePoint online, I need to look for your name, so I need to have this list, not because Microsoft wants to open a server there, because otherwise it wouldn't work. So now we'll see that external it's a bit different. You can just see this is the user thing. One of the options is that I create a user. The problem is that what happened if that external was kicked out and I wasn't warned, because he still had access. Then we have another option, which was send him the document, but if he wants, he can take it away because I lost control over the document. Now what we have in Azure AD, if you want to create a user, you can create it, but you have the opportunity of creating a guest. A guest is like a pointer for the guest in his Azure AD. So I have Azure AD and you have Azure AD. When you invite me, you invite my user. You don't control my identities, the external guys, and that's shocking for some people. You don't control the externals, but you control the access to your resources. Okay? Besides, normally the external guy is the problem with lifecycle, because you don't know if he's kicked out or he's still there, or if he requests a new password, the K1 knows what to do. In that case, as the guy who's entered is still his account, he loses the access. When you create a new user, you have the opportunity of just inviting them. I said Azure AD and you too, but it necessarily doesn't need to have Azure AD, because if he has an email address, you just send an in-password account and he can get in. These are the permissions. They are limited. They cannot invite others, or yes, depending on what do you can configure, or you cannot list the directory. But consider that before everyone was a user. Now we have 2 options. We have the user and the guest, and that lets us play with the permissions we give to each of them. So Those who think that don't use Azure AD, probably they're using it because they are being invited, the users are being invited to other people organizations. In fact, I don't know which would talk, I think it was Chema's talk about expired domains. I think that nobody has explored that, just for your reference. What happens if a company disappears and its Azure ID never expires, but its email does? And you become the administration, you can take the Azure ID and you have access to your Azure ID. There's nothing inside, but you have the access to invitations to other companies. I control it from the directory. Not everything is synchronized. For instance, devices are created directly on the cloud, and you will see many objects. Okay, we just use it for internal people. By default, you can invite external people, and you can, but in any case, you can restrict that, even if it is whitelist or blacklist. But in general, it's open, so you can invite people from other domains. This is something that you need to check also. On another subject, because I want to explain the demo that we will see. Note this. We have a web application there, which is Contoso Clinic, which is publicly available on the internet. Behind that, there's a database with a SQL behind that. Within that SQL, there's another application. There are other applications. The human resource database. They have to recreate these users and generate passwords. So what they did was this called Managed Instant, which is especially designed for virtual machines that are executed in Azure, and you are giving a way to ask for tokens with an identity which is not a user, so you don't need to create a user in the ESQL server. The virtual machine can request token to Azure AD to access to some resources, for instance, to Azure AD to maybe reset passwords. That's a traditional thing. That code request, it's not done through email, but it's done through the infrastructure of Azure AD itself. Let's see if I can show this on live. Please excuse me if this doesn't work because I'm working on 3G network. Maybe I can show you a video. This is Contoso Clinic. I come to patient and I can find a person. What happens here? I don't know if someone is seeing this in Contoso Clinic. This is just an example that says SQL injection hints. This is a demo to just show an SQL injection. If instead of putting this, I want him to play XCPSL for this administrator should be killed. For enabling this, I want to create to execute a PowerShell and create a file, in this case it's not 322, let's say rooted, and we just click on it. It says there's no type of directory, there's no much more, this is a traditional SQL, so it seems that it doesn't do anything. But if we go to the server, let's check on server, is it around? Has it been created? I wasn't showing the virtual machine. Did I do something wrong? Did I write something wrong? Just excuse me, please. There's a space missing somewhere. Oh, okay, here. Here it goes. And now it goes. We have remote execution. Apart from the rest, I'm going to show it from the virtual machine because it's easier to show, and you can see the output. But we could launch it from there, actually. You see. I can make a call to this endpoint, which is a 169.254, which is the endpoint which is internal. Only the virtual machine can call this endpoint, and I want it to access the Azure AD API. And when I said Azure AD is an API, it's an API. It's not true because there are 3 versions, and each version has its own versions because in the end we want it to not stop working. So we want it to have backwards compatibility. There's no much thing here. It will obtain a token. I convert it from JSON. I can extract to a file, and if I look at it, we have a token there. Can I take this token to another file and use it, to other machine and use it? What do you think? I do. I can do it. Yes, just to simplify it, I will do it here, but I tested it. You get this file, this text file, you take it to another machine, and it works. And if I did it, as I don't have the access to results, I would do this request and I would save it in any website, and you are the user, and that should be it. In this case, what we're going to do, before that, before continuing, is to look and see. I'm going to my own machine. I'm going to do is to enter in Azure AD, log in with that user. That is one of these guests that I mentioned before. And if I say I want to list, it let me in because I'm invited. If I tell it I want you to list who are for the role company administrator, I think we're going to conclude the video because this 3G network is not working too well. I'm going to show this in a PPT. Just wait a minute, please. It's just this. I log in with the user. I get Azure directory role, and it said access denied. Why? Because I'm not in my own system. I'm a guest. If I want to see who's the goal administrator, I can do it. I reconnect again with a user who is from this tenant, and it says then, okay, there are 3 users. I get the role, who are the members, and it says there are 3. There are internal guests, and SQL, and myself. So the SQL is global administrator of Azure AD because it cannot create users. In fact, there's no need for it to be administrator. But here they just make it a global administrator to be able to create users. If I go back to my SQL, that means that this token that I have obtained is a global administrator. Therefore, I can reset the passwords for another user that was a global administrator. If I try to enter with this credential, it's not valid. It's just from the machine. I can steal the token and I can use it against Azure AD, but I don't have a user to log in. So I do this. The lower part is just to see the example of Hotason. It's just to call again the API, passing the API that I obtained before, and I call it to reset the password. What I'm doing here is to reset the password. If now I come to Azure AD, to the private network and enter, as the user, I have just resetted the password with the password that I want to show. Because I make it, I don't know if you realize, but I made it global element. So telling you the password, it's not very funny for me. But if I come here, I log in. I tell that the password is this one. Okay, great. Let's get in. Do you know what I did? I just resetted the password. It's the first time this user enters. I don't care about the recommendations. If I tell Azure Active Directory, you can see it as a part of the description, but in fact it's an independent object. But this one's a global element, so I come to roles. So I can come here and say, let's say I want to look for the role that I want, which is global administrator, and I can tell it to add someone. For instance, this guy, add. So I became global admin. Okay, just summarizing, I'm seeing your faces. Contoso Cleans had an SQL injection error. And besides, it allowed XP DSML, something that is disabled from 15 years ago, but somebody has enabled that. So SQL code can be executed as SQL, and it could, with its own identity, the server's identity was as a global element, so it could act the metadata instance, get a token that I could have taken to another machine, even if I use it locally here, and use it against Azure AD to reset the password to another user who is already a user. I could log in as him, so maybe through the API I could have entered someone as a global admin. So summary: protect global admin. This is related to an attack to a bank which has happened recently. This is helpful, but it's not the solution. So the way we can list who has been global admin, it has been the user, but never the guest. But well, we pass the slides quickly. Notice that I said that the token can be taken away, but in general hasn't been considered as a problem, but it's going to be more and more critical, because nowadays, as people still use user and password, that's a weak part of the chain. But this weak part, this is becoming less and less that case, because we're making them more useful. And the next step would be to use tokens. If we're going to talk about lateral movement, traditionally was the parse of hash. If I steal your hash, it's like I'm you. And in that case, if I steal your token, it's like I'm you. Well, that's not that completely true. Nowadays, there are some of these things that started 15 years ago, 18 years ago with smart cards, but now smart cards in an Active Directory would be by creating a new hash. I'm going from right to left. You still could have hash passes. Like 5 years ago, we had this credential guard, which are using visualization-based guide with the serverless tickets. The hashes were kept in a different virtual machine, and even if you became administrator, they couldn't be stolen. This is being extended as a binding token. There's another security piece, which is the machine's TPM, where you can keep secrets so that even if someone is an administrator, he cannot take it away from there. With Microsoft accounts, which is Hotmail, or Azure AD accounts, tokens, login tokens, which be like the granting ticket from Kerberos, are being encrypted and they are signed with a secret that is kept in the TTM. Therefore, you cannot just take it away. But the tokens that we get afterwards, which are the service tickets or the waiver tokens that come in access some, depending on how you call it, to access to our resource, those are not protected. What is the spin-off of this? The spin-off is that they cannot be stolen. The tokens cannot be stolen. Login tokens from Azure AD cannot be taken to another machine and be used as a machine. But you can access to a resource. If the person has access to an XC resource, you can get that and use it. In a binding company, they're working so that you cannot do this. But token binding has two tastes. The problem is that you cannot take it to a laptop, to a PC. But the second taste, let's say, is that how can I do it so they cannot take it from one session to another, that it just works in a TLS session. There are several technologies that have tried to do this. I call it channel binding token, which in the end is that a token is related to the certification of a TLS session. That would be great if nobody broke TLS in transit, TLS sessions in transit, but people like to do these TLS inspections, and if they break those inspections, this stops working, and this has not been imposed yet, because it will come. This goes together with the TLS standard 1.3. So TLS standard 1.3 says that Diffie-Hellman ephemeris, Diffie-Hellman, and the consequences are that, or either you decrypt all the traffic or not, and you cannot do passive inspection. You have to break the traffic, and once you break it, you cannot stop breaking it. Therefore, the conclusion of this, if you have an inspection in TLS 1.3, it won't work to associate a token to a SSL session, because you're breaking the part in between. So one thing or the other. In the case of Microsoft, you will see that we have proxies and we don't have them anymore. And what we used to do in inspection, now it's done in the client position. And the reason is because of that, because we don't want to break the traffic. If you look at the fight, world level fight, they say the traffic cannot be broken in an intermediate device, and it's something that I encourage you to read. I don't know how I'm going about time. Well, plenty of time. Here are some miscellaneous. I could have more. Something that we always talk about, which is legacy authentication. Maybe you send to Azure AD password and a user, and all spray attacks are done with this. So if it's still enabled, you should disable it. The biggest problem that you will find here is that the client, Outlook client, from Android doesn't support modern authentication in 2020. So you use Outlook or you have a problem. iOS supports it recently. That's the biggest problem. Apart from that, it shouldn't be a problem if you remove it, if people use Outlook. Secure defaults. How old is your AAD tenant? When did you start using Office 365 or Azure? Because the default security is not the same. If you use it now, you created 6 months ago, you wouldn't have two-factor administration, but now you do. Identity secure store. Microsoft puts a score to your Azure AD. It compares to your industry, to your sector. You are the weakest one. You didn't implement multifactoring, so you should do something. This is free, so I recommend you to check of it, and it tells you if it's okay or not. We haven't mentioned about consents and application consents, which would be another complete speech. And maybe for the red teamers, there's a back bounty for this. If you get to skip the authentication with multifactor, it's $100,000, so it's a big price. And finally, an initiative that I like, it's blockchain-based identity. This will overpass this blockchain hype, but this one, I think it will stay. And the idea is that the authenticator itself works like that. It keeps your identity, and Azure AD is not another one that signs that you have an Azure AD user, but your identity is kept in your own device. I think with that, if you have any questions, thank you very much for your time. Any question? Hello, thank you for the talk. I'm going to ask a generic question, but it's if we are concerned about security or the optimization capacity of the API graph of Graph API, because there have been a case often some tools using this API that allows us what that you have shown in the console, but in a more automated way. It's not concerned. If it's concerned, of course, that's why Microsoft created this 20 years ago. But the first time we invented it, bug bounties, were invented by us. That's why we have a bug bounty of 100,000. But in theory, be good and tell that to the Microsoft, and there will be $100,000 for you. So it's concerning, of course. My question goes in line of about MFA and security and permissions. Nowadays, or at least what I found on a professional level, is a lot of difficulties of tracking the activity on Graph. It's true that there's a registry. When you give a token or something, you could detect that, but the activity on the app from someone who's abusing about the API, whether by bad intentions, it's very difficult for me to track it down. I agree with you, there is a way to improve. Sometimes they are quite dark. There have been researcher has seen that through consent he can do that. The service principal application is not the same as the one that seems to have done the token one. So there's a way to improve. This audits everything. Apart from that, it's trivial to interpret if the token has been used or not. And I agree with you that there's a long way to improve. Any other question? Thank you very much. Thank you, Fernando.